Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Welcome back to the Red Light Exposé podcast. Again, with me, Elly Arrow, coming to you from Germany. Today's agenda is the impact of modern internet porn on young people, on kids and early 20 folk and their developing sexuality, and the place where so many of us go, myself included. You know, you type your questions into the internet. At best, it's cosmopolitan, and cosmopolitan has a lot of problematic content. And at worst, very quickly, you land on internet porn. And to help me navigate the subject today, I have a guest. Today with us is Ruth Breslin from Ireland, who's the director of the Sexual Exploitation Research and Policy Institute. And before we jump into the topic, Ruth, I'd like to ask you what brought you to this work, because it is still like an under-researched field, and many people have, they're hesitant to dive into it for many different reasons. So why did you take the dive?
Sure. I think I'm still asking myself that question. So first of all, hi, Elly. It's great to be here on the podcast. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I think it's a really nice chance for us to kind of get into a good bit of detail about this issue and just highlighting some of what we found through our research. So yeah, I think I'm still sometimes wake up in the morning and ask myself this question, like, how did I end up working on these issues, on issues of sexual exploitation more broadly? Because our institute has a kind of three areas of focus in terms of commercial sexual exploitation. So prostitution, trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation, and then more recently our work on pornography. So I've been working on issues of violence against women and girls for, I think it's 25 years now. I think actually it might be a little bit longer than 25 years. And I started out, I think it's interesting that my very first role was doing a small piece of research. I knew as a student that I wanted to do research, and I suppose I came to feminism as a student as well. And I wanted to do feminist research, and sort of by accident and serendipity, I actually ended up working on a research project for a year in women's aid in Ireland, which is kind of funny in a way that I've come full circle, because this study on pornography that we did last year, that we published last year, was commissioned by Women's Aid in Ireland. But I've worked in, I suppose, various different contexts in academia, but also I've worked in a lot of frontline organisations addressing violence against women and girls. And I've done that in Ireland, also in the UK, and a little bit in the US as well. So I was lucky enough when I was young to get a scholarship to the London School of Economics and to study a master's in research methods. And I very quickly wanted to apply that to issues of violence against women. So I suppose I was exposed, especially when I was working in London, to a lot of like second wave feminists, some really, really amazing women that really introduced me to this issue. So I was working on issues of domestic violence and rape and sexual assault and their treatment in the criminal justice system. And I suppose I was introduced to the ideas of sex trafficking, of prostitution, of stripping, of all of these women's experiences in the commercial sex trade. And I suppose what really struck me was that on the one hand, we were having this conversation about, I suppose we were starting to have the conversations about consent, but we were just having this conversation about how women deal with all this unwanted sexual contact from men, and how we somehow have boundaries and protect those boundaries, and how we don't want to be objectified. And it was an era of lad magazines, men's magazines, really objectifying women on every single page. And we were having all these discussions about how we fight back against that. And then I suppose I came to this realization that while at the same time, while women were talking about all these, unwanted sexual experiences, society at the same time seemed to think it was okay that there was this group of women that we could just pay to have unwanted sexual experiences. And, that somehow the money made that okay. And I think it just struck me as the very kind of essence, or the very core of violence against women in a way, or the very core of misogyny. And it was something that I wanted to understand further. And then over the years, I met like many amazing survivors who also really helped me to understand the issue of sexual exploitation and what it means to end up in that place in the sex trade, and how that can impact your life in a very long lasting way, and what it means to be a victim, what it means to be a survivor. So I think I've learned a lot from those women along the way and through the research. So yeah, it was an issue that once you get hooked into it, it's hard. Well, I found it hard to leave go.
Yes.
And I also have to recognize that, it's a privilege to work on this issue, because I suppose as researchers, we bear witness to so many women's first-hand experiences, and we're bearing witness. And there's lots of women who can't, for loads of reasons, talk very publicly about their experiences in the sex trade. So sometimes we have a role as researchers to kind of share the learning from their experiences, or just to share, what's happened to women inside the sex trade, while at the same time obviously protecting those women's identity. So I think it's really important to have different platforms for the truth about the sex trade to be shared, I suppose. And we hope that our research contributes to that. Yeah, so it led me to really focus on looking at issues of prostitution and trafficking. And then I said more recently pornography, because of course you only have to look at those things to, first of all, to see how incredibly interlinked they are, but also to see how they're all part of this massive global commercial sex trade, in which some people are making enormous amounts of money, but very often, or very, very seldom, the ones making the money are the women who actually end up in this trade.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
To listeners who might be new to the show, most of our other episodes focus on the reality of and the short-term and long-term impacts of the industry on the people in it, the people in the brothel or in front of the camera. But today we're mostly going to be speaking about the porn consumer, and specifically the young consumer. And we're specifically talking about the information collected and the insights gained from your institute on the subject in the study called Facing Reality, Addressing the Role of Pornography in the Pandemic of Violence Against Women and Girls, which can be found on your website, as well as other research that I do recommend people look for. But so I read the study bit by bit. It is hard reading. I imagine it was hard to research. It does really hit you in the gut several times, because there's so much in it. Much of it I did know, but not the numbers around it. So to start us off, here's some numbers that stood out to me. So just, to quantify the issue a little bit, 12% is estimated of all internet content is estimated to be porn. And that's around 25 million websites. And about a quarter of all internet queries are search for explicit material. And that's not counting when you accidentally stumble on it, I just wanted to watch Pirates of the Caribbean. That was my accidental exposure. I mean, that's how do you get from Pirates of the Caribbean to porn, right? And the average age of exposure today is around 12, though for many kids it's younger. I think I was 13 or 14 in my case. And some, it's as young as 7. I believe one other number was a quarter of 6-year-olds now have smartphones in Ireland. Am I getting that right? And we know the younger people start, the more likely they are to be long-term and high-frequency consumers. So, What did you find looking at the research that's been done, the numbers that have been collected? What are the ways that kids and young people are finding porn? Where do they find it? And why is it so likely to get many of them hooked?
So I would just preface that, Elly, by saying you're right. One of the things that we did try to emphasize in this study is the harms on both sides of the screen. So I know we're talking today, as you said, and as you clarified, a lot about the harms to the consumer, and particularly young people. But we did really try to emphasize the harms also to the women involved in pornography production. And we documented that to a certain extent in our study. And I think it's quite problematic. Okay, it's really positive that we're starting to really focus on and highlight and foreground the harms of pornography. But I fear that the harm to the consumer might overtake the harm to those involved in the production.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
I think it's great, and I absolutely know that with your podcast that you're foregrounding those experiences, in other episodes, and I think that is really important to do, because there's just no doubt that the grip of this industry, it destroys lives. I think that's what we were trying to show and trying to demonstrate in the research that we drew together. It's destroying lives on both sides of the screen, whether it's the consumption or the production. But particularly in relation to young people, I think like that 12% of the internet is porn sites. I think that probably doesn't actually take in the amount of pornography that's available on or via social media, or at least that social media is the hook in, the first link or the first thing you find that then maybe directs you to that mainstream pornography site. So we really saw that with young people, and there's a really helpful study by the Children's Commissioner in England. It's a few years old now, but she identified that the platform where actually the young people in her study were most encountering pornography was actually Twitter, now called X, followed by dedicated pornography sites, which young people are well aware of, and it's kind of part of their conversations, followed by Instagram, followed by Snapchat, followed by finding them via search engines. So that gives some sense of, there's lots of different ways and means and routes in. And also we looked sometimes at the intentions and motivations. And what we were finding was that young people, I think you said you were looking for Pirates of the Caribbean. So yes. I think we found that young people under the age of 14, their discovery of pornography was actually more likely unintentional. They stumbled across it. Whereas over 14, I guess with a growing interest just in sex, like a natural curiosity about sex, it might be more likely that they've heard of this thing called pornography and they're more actively looking for it. But the stumbling across it is, I think, a big issue, because this is where we see really, really young people coming across it, like children, small children. And another thing that I noted in the research, and also from some of our key informants that we interviewed for the study, was being exposed by an older child, like often an older family member, like an older sibling or a cousin or something like that, that some young children are ending up really quite traumatized by what their older cousin just happened to show them on his phone, So we definitely see cases of that, the stumbling across it, the being exposed to it by somebody who's maybe an older peer or older sibling. But also we have to remember, pornography doesn't exist in a vacuum. The platforms are really clever at drawing new customers in. And actually, that includes children and young people. So there was an allegation, I was never able to verify this, but there's an allegation, for example, that the pornography industry studies the common keystroke errors of children. So they're typing something into a search engine that is totally benign, but perhaps they make spelling mistakes. And the porn industry have explored this to find ways to bring children to their platform. The mainstream pornography platforms such as Pornhub will always argue that they never, ever, ever want a child or young person under 18 on their platform. And yet, every year, they're quite happy to post insight blogs on what favourite kind of genres and topics and themes are on the likes of Pornhub. And, they produce a whole blog post on the favourite gaming themes. And some of the top favourite gaming themes on Pornhub are Pokemon, Minecraft and Fortnite. Games that are played primarily actually by children, or at least very, very popular amongst children around the world. I had also read something that said that content was being tagged with themes like Paw Patrol. I don't know if you have this in Germany, but it's like...
Yes, we do.
It's cartoon dogs, right?
Yeah.
very popular with kids, and that content was deliberately being tagged with Paw Patrol to appear in searches. So I tried to verify this, and what I found instead is Paw Patrol themed pornography. So look, anything that you can think of that's beloved of children has a theme in pornography. And if you tell me that somehow deters or won't draw children and young people in, well, I can't believe that. So I feel like there's also a very active trade behind this. So there's all the sharing and the stumbling upon, and they may be intentionally going looking for, but there's also a trade drawing young people in.
It's just, there's an example that's coming to my mind where I didn't expect pornography, but I found it by accident. I was playing Hogwarts Legacy, which is obviously based on the Harry Potter universe, and it is a broadly, I'd say, child-friendly game. We know there's big objectification of women in the gaming industry, and I have a lot of qualms with that, and we'll probably make an entire episode dedicated to that subject. But because I dabble in sewing and costume making and cosplaying, I was just looking for some of the characters from the game, and what came up, porn of these in the original game. These are totally normal characters. There's no sexual element at all. They are in like Victorian style clothing, and I can't even look up like how would I mimic the dress style of this professor or something at Hogwarts, and what comes up.
Yes.
Porn.
And this is it. And young people, after talking about stumbling upon or discovering pornography, in their social media feeds or whatever, sharing with friends on social media, they also did talk quite a lot actually in the England Children's Commissioner study about adverts and pop-ups on sites that were just things like mainstream film or sports or gaming sites, or as you're saying, kind of hobby sites or platforms. I think what we've got to realize is the pornography trade is ready and prepared, and probably already has sexualized literally everything. Everything you can think of. They have created a sexualized version of it to cater to some taste, or to drive people who just have non-sexualized tastes in something like cosplay down that road. I think they've thought of everything. And, the genres, the popularity of the genres also change over time and often get more extreme. So like a really popular theme in pornography right now is essentially incest.
Yes.
And that used to be about step relatives, right? So stepfathers with stepdaughters, etc., etc. And actually that's increasingly moved towards pornography that is essentially depicting sex between blood relatives. So fathers and daughters, brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces, grandfathers and daughters, that kind of thing. I feel like there's nowhere they'll stop, really.
The concerning thing with that is, and another example we found recently on the show, we made an episode on the subject of sex for rent, which we would say really sexual abuse for rent. And when I Googled that, again, porn comes up.
Right.
And now that you say incest, well, if a girl looks something like "Daddy touched me,"
yes,
and she doesn't have the safety filter on, is she going to find actual information on how to get help, or will she find porn? And well, the latter scenario is quite likely.
I suspect she'll find pornography more quickly if there's no kind of safeguards or guardrails in place. Yes.
So we're already in a very dark place here. It's not going to get any better. Well, at the very end, we will discuss some potential steps towards solutions. But first, we do have to map out the issue. And just to go deeper, I think you just started us off on the. Well, I think first of all, it looks like the porn industry is very intentionally going for kids. And why wouldn't they? The fast food industry would like to hook them for life.
Totally.
All other industries do it. Why wouldn't this one? I mean, but I want to go deeper into what kind of material is this? Because, well, a lot of adults are also watching it, but there is people of an older generation, and still the majority of women do not know what's happening on porn sites. So maybe if they do, it's cursory. And so I would like to actually outline what is so I'm not talking about what is today deemed extreme. I'm talking about like fairly average stuff that can be stumbled upon on porn sites, because as your study outlines, where we're at with average and normal, it's already quite concerning in terms of both the themes and the acts done to women, mostly women, some men as well.
Yeah, there's quite a lot to be said about this. And just reflecting back very quickly just on the children, it's Gail Dines, I think, who says you get them as young as possible to keep them for as long as you can, or for life, you know. So you draw them in when they're consumers in when they're very young, because then they'll hopefully kind of get hooked really and stick with you. And that's definitely what's happening here. But in terms of the content, where to start? So there was content in pornography back in probably the 1970s and 80s that was considered very niche or extreme, and that you would have to go looking really hard for. And this is when pornography was in print, right, in a magazine, and then increasingly on VHS, videotape. But you would have to look hard for some of the content that was considered very extreme. But now that extreme is entirely in the mainstream. It is entirely the kind of mainstay thoroughfare of mainstream pornography on all the big and well-known platforms is extremely violent. So and the violence, the majority of it, more than 90%, is directed towards women in the scenes. And what we're talking about here is all forms of aggression. So first of all, loads and loads of horrible verbal aggression of the worst kind of name calling and misogynistic kind of abuse of women, verbal abuse. But also we are talking here about physical aggression, slapping, spanking, hair pulling, ejaculation in orifices, but very often on women's bodies, on women's faces, in women's eyes. Anal sex is increasingly popular in the content, particularly that which is very forceful, and strangulation is extremely common. And we made a kind of feature of this in the research, which sounds like an odd thing to say, but we just thought that it was really important first to define it, and also then to demonstrate how common strangulation has become in sexual relationships now. So first of all, it's known in pornography as choking, or sometimes breath play, but choking usually refers actually technically to something that's obstructing the inside of the throat, something that an object that you're choking on. What it really is that we're talking about here is strangulation. So it's the placing of the hands, legs, or a ligature or some other object around nearly always a woman's neck and pressing. And it's actually an extremely dangerous practice, but it's entered common sexual practice. And all the experts have looked at this, are really clear, I think, that this is very much pornography inspired. So you have all of these kind of acts, gagging women with a penis, double penetration by several men or in several orifices, all at the same time. Like all of these things that I think are extreme, are aggressive. And we went back all the time to the seminal content analysis that has been done in this area, which is quite old now, but still I feel is the gold standard in terms of a scene-by-scene analysis of what's going on. And that showed that over 90% of scenes contain aggression. That in, again, over 90% of cases, women are the target of that aggression, but also that in the vast majority of cases, and I think this is really important, the women in the scenes are required to respond either neutrally or with pleasure to that aggression. And what that's setting up right there is that extreme aggression, abuse, forcefulness, etc., is eroticized. Pornography eroticizes violence against women. And then I suppose the conclusion we drew, and I think it's again really important to highlight this, because I think you're right, there's lots of adults like my age and older that don't understand what the real content of mainstream pornography is today, because they remember Playboy, or they remember the early days of dial-up internet where you type in breasts and it might take 5 minutes for a pair of naked breasts to upload onto your screen or download onto your screen. So they remember that, and they have no idea about the kind of immersive and highly aggressive nature of it. So I think what we concluded was pornography claims in many ways to represent or portray sex, but actually what it's portraying to us is sexual violence. And if you're an adult who knows enough about that, or has had enough sexual experiences in their life to know the difference between those things, maybe you can go and watch it and make that distinction, right? Although we can't forget what's actually happening to the woman in that scene. At the end of the day, this is very real for her. No matter how much you wrap it up as fantasy, it's very real for her to be filmed having these acts perpetrated against her. But the problem is that children and young people are coming to this often with no frame of reference. And I'm meeting now educators who are saying that they are working with young people who have been watching pornography for years and have never yet had an in-person sexual experience in their life.
Or even a kiss.
Or even a kiss, right? Even a kiss. And they're coming to pornography and they have gone there or ended up or stumbled there believing that what they're going to find out about is sex. What they're seeing is sexual violence, but they don't have the critical skills yet to make the difference. So look, it's hardly surprising that this is being translated into their own real life in-person sexual experiences. That sexual violence is almost, these violent acts are a go-to because they've learned from pornography that this is actually what's standard stroke, quote unquote, normal, what's expected. So
what women want.
Yes, what women want, right? Exactly. And there's a gender difference here, right? Because it's telling boys this is what you have to do to women, and it's teaching girls this is what you have to submit to from men.
Yes, this is what grown women enjoy.
Yeah.
And so I came to this issue around 10 years ago when all of this was already pretty bad. And this is the issue that caused me to enter the fight, because this is when I really saw it. There's no running from this. It impacts everyone, whether it's you're the young person yourself, you're dating them, or you're the parent or whatever. And what was already being said back then, 10 years ago, was doing research on porn is quite tricky for several reasons. One, it is difficult to get a big cohort who hasn't watched a lot of porn or any porn to have a comparison group. And also, we can't guarantee that both researchers and research subjects won't be permanently harmed by the research. And the fact that ethics committees have come to this conclusion, I don't know why we still need more evidence that porn is harmful when that is the case.
Right.
So it's not safe for the adult researchers and research subjects, but some people still contest that it is causing a global crisis among young people, which I find bizarre.
Right. So one of the things we explored when we were doing this initial study, which was, kind of rapid review of the literature and then interviews with key informants, is what would we like to study next and in greater depth? And we immediately hit those ethical obstacles. We immediately hit them because there's massive ethical concerns around, even as you say, exposing adult researchers to this content, having to undertake a content analysis and do it scene by scene. Like we were talking about that in our team, saying, do any of us have the stomach for this? Do any of us have the stomach for this? And I suppose I'm only talking here from a researcher perspective, because I've sat with many women who are survivors of prostitution and they've told me what they had to do in prostitution. And that's incredibly painful to listen to, but again, important to bear witness to. But it's perhaps a different matter hearing that story and actually watching it on a screen.
Yes.
So we have those ethical issues around doing research. And then we also have the issues of the fact that, generally speaking, although this situation is changing as we speak, but generally speaking, there's certain safeguards in place for moderators on platforms, like on mainstream social media platforms, although yes, Mark Zuckerberg has announced his changes to that. But, there's rules around moderation and recognition that moderators need psychological supports because of the content they're exposed to. And that includes sexually violent content. So again, this is another group of adults that we say they need protection. And it's just wild that at the same time, we don't understand that our children can see this content in 2 taps or 2 clicks. We just don't understand it. And so for parents, because I talk to parents a lot about this, there's 2 places they're coming from. One is they think pornography is a Playboy magazine. They're not as naive as that, but they remember the content of Playboy. And I try to explain to them that is like sweet romanticism compared with what is in pornography now. And also it's the kind of not my child syndrome. Oh, yeah. Well, maybe all his friends are looking at it, or maybe the naughty boys in his classroom are looking at it, but my child wouldn't look at that. And that's why one of the reasons we call the study Facing Reality.
Yeah.
You're encouraging people to face up to the fact that this is part of your young person's experience growing up. And also, and again, interestingly, speaking to educators about this, okay, maybe you have 100% protected your teenage child from this content. Maybe you've been able to keep them in a little bit of a safe bubble and they haven't been exposed to it. But do you know what? That actually doesn't really matter so much, because all their peers have been, and it is in the culture. It is in their peers' culture. It's in the misogynistic comments in the classroom. It's in what happens between 2 young people when they get intimate. It's there. It's influenced attitudes. It's influenced behaviors. It's influenced young people's understanding of what sex is, or what the porn industry thinks it's meant to be. So no young person really now at least in the Western world, is untouched by this.
There was one subtopic, one thing that the study honed in on, and that was around kids who are still unsure about their sexual orientation. And I have a lot of anecdotes about this, again, from just growing up in a porn culture. So I remember when I went to school in the OOs, lesbian and gay, those were still insults and dirty words.
Mm-hmm.
And to many of us, that was more a porn category than actually, adult or young adult loving sexuality and romance. So that's very sad. Lesbian, especially to many of us, was just a porn genre. And of course, we know that lesbian porn is largely made for straight men. And then gay porn doesn't necessarily represent everyone who's gay. There's a lot of role assigning there that not all gay men subscribe to. Again, I'll speak from personal experience. Today, I know that I'm straight, but when I was still unsure about it around 14 when I was exposed, I did find the material so disturbing that I wondered, if I don't like this, and I did make a conscious choice to not seek it out much further, does that mean I'm asexual? And there is a huge rise of young people, I see it all around me, calling themselves asexual. And it is I want to be very careful. I never want to push anyone to go and seek out sexual experiences when they don't want to. So and it might really be the case that somebody is asexual and sexuality is not for them, but I think our porn culture is also producing false positives in this area, because I lived it as a teen for a while. I just refused everything because I thought what I saw in porn would be what I would expect when I actually have a boyfriend. And I mean, for all the claims that this is sex positive and enlightening and progressive, it actually makes some people want to shut down that whole drive. And so when very, very young people say they're asexual, I sometimes wonder, are you actually asexual or are you not pornosexual? Which begs the question whether anyone is truly pornosexual, of course. What are your thoughts on this aspect of it?
I think it's just, first of all, to say two things, or many things perhaps, but I think that's so interesting to hear that from your personal experience. So first of all, pornography is primarily made by heterosexual men with heterosexual men and boys in mind. And, looking at the kind of what's in the mainstream of pornography today, it's sometimes known as gonzo pornography, which is very much a kind of, there's very little storyline. It's scene after scene of quite hardcore extreme acts, and within that there's a sort of, I don't know if it's a sort of a subgenre of this like point of view pornography, right, where the camera is in the place of one of the quote unquote performers. It's right in the middle of the scene, so you're seeing the acts really visually and viscerally up close. But what maybe people don't realize to begin with is it's usually from the point of view of the man. It's the camera is in the eyes of the man, focused on the woman and her body and what's being done to the woman's body. And I would say the same in terms of things that are assigned or called lesbian porn. That's made not for the pleasure of women or lesbians. It's made because it's a fantasy of men and boys to observe or watch or consume this. And yet I have heard girls talk about finding refuge in lesbian pornography.
Yes.
For precisely the reason that you talked about, is because the mainstream pornography that they have viewed is actually so frightening to them. But again, that's translating into their real world experiences. So there is, and I mean, it's somewhat anecdotal perhaps at this stage, but I've certainly heard it in the Irish context. There are young girls who are saying, I never want to have sex with a boy or a man. I'm terrified too. It looks terrifying. It looks painful. I don't want to go down that road. So I'll protect myself by staying away from even any thoughts of that. Or, there was one of the young women in the England Children's Commissioner study, I think it was in that study, she spoke about, I just decided to watch lesbian porn because at least it would be less violent. So I just stuck to that. It was a little bit safer or more comfortable for me, even though she didn't identify, she didn't consider herself a lesbian. So I think there's all of that going on in terms of us really addressing this. Is there a link? I would love to know. I don't necessarily know the answer, but is there a link in the rise of young people describing themselves as asexual and either having had very negative sexual experiences, or just, particularly in the case of girls and young women, viewing mainstream pornography and thinking, if this is sex with men or boys, well, then this is not for me because of the violence, the degradation, the name calling, the objectification, the dehumanization, all of that. So yeah, I come back to thinking that you're not alone in that experience, and that experience is probably a growing one for girls and young women.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I've only heard it anecdotally, but I spent some time of my life living in Japan and some of it in the US, so I can speak to like 3 different continents, and girls are sharing this experience of being quite frightened of their first sexual encounters. And then I remember, I mean, of course, as feminists, when we look at the historic context, like we do realize that our mothers, grandmothers, great grandmothers endured a lot in the same arena. It's just sad that we've made so much progress, but this is still one where we seem really stuck and partially regressing.
Yeah,
actually.
Yeah, it is a regression. And, you know, we were very clear in doing this study and also then in communicating the findings afterwards that this isn't about censorship, you know, or being prudish or being anti-sex or being anti-men or all of those things, you know, that feminists are often like tired with, that it wasn't about that at all. That in fact, we do want sex positivity. We want everyone, adults and young people, to have happy, healthy, positive sexual relationships. But porn is ruining that for us. It's actually ruining it. So we kind of came to the conclusion that to be sex positive is to be porn critical.
Yeah.
And that was reflected in a conversation I had with a friend recently. She's a good bit younger than me, and she's kind of in the dating scene, etc. And she explained to me how when she meets a guy and she's going to get intimate with them, and he seems like a nice guy, she likes him, she's attracted to him, etc., etc. And before she has like a full sexual encounter with him, she has to tell him, by the way, just to let you know before we do this, I don't like to be choked.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how have we got to that place?
Yes. Yeah.
So I think prior to such a heavy influence of pornography in young people's lives, of course, it doesn't mean that all young people's sexual encounters were perfect. You know, there was experimentation, there was things that went wrong. Of course, there was non-consensual stuff, you know, and assault and rape. Of course, all of that was happening. But people who are kind of my age and older now describe the fun of experimenting as a teenager with figuring out with somebody that you maybe like, you know, or have some level of trust with, figuring out what is sex, what do you do? Whereas now young people are coming to this with a fully shaped sexual script that's been provided them by pornography. It's very little about what they organically find they like to do.
Yes.
It's very kind of prescribed and set up for them. Yeah, so the spontaneity and the organic nature of it is gone. But also there's very little in it about women's pleasure or girls' pleasure. Like the message from pornography is to please men. Or sometimes the message is that a woman says no, but she really means yes. It's also a message that women really enjoy aggression, or, you know, really enjoy very forceful anal sex, etc., etc. It's all of these kind of prescribed and set out assumptions that boys are learning. Oh, this is what women like. They like to have their hair pulled and be strangled, etc., etc., etc. And I haven't surveyed every woman and girl in the world, but I'd say the majority do not want to engage in those acts that are painful, that many women describe as degrading, are risky, etc., etc.
Yeah, so I think we desperately need a redefinition of sex positivity. At the moment, it is, you need to at least have tried everything under the sun, essentially. I mean, kink and BDSM are now extremely normalized. I have many friends who've dabbled in it. This used to be an incredibly niche area, and now it's the lighter parts of it are now just mainstream. And I think actual sex positivity has to be a lot about everyone at their own pace, everyone ideally without a ton of outside influence directing things. And yeah, I mean, we face the accusation of prudishness all the time. I mean, I'd rather be called a prude than leave girls and women alone, because I know there's so many of them that until they find any porn critical material think they're the only one who don't like it. Their peers seem to, because many put on a brave face through it. But just to go back to the specific acts, I briefly want to hone in on the subject of anal sex, because it's, I mean, yeah, it's one of those where you get called a prude if have you tried it? Da, da, da. But in the study, it said a third of 16 to 24-year-olds had tried it, and one of the, I mean, I come across it periodically, just statements from gynecologists and healthcare nurses describing the risks. It's ridiculous. I mean, I think one aspect of sex positivity has to be nobody ends up injured short-term or long-term as a result, or we keep that risk to a reasonable minimum. And can you elaborate what some of the healthcare professionals have said regarding anal sex specifically?
So I think, as I said, anal sex is a very common act in mainstream pornography. It tends to err towards the more forceful side. There's some very interesting research that suggests the younger the woman, the more forceful the anal sex that's used, that she experiences in the production of pornography. So forceful anal sex in the teen porn genre appears to be increasingly prevalent and popular. I think it's really a good thing that it's healthcare professionals that are speaking out about this, because obviously, it's still, I suppose, an intimate thing that people would find difficult to talk about. But one of our key informants in our study is a GP, a general practitioner, which is a kind of doctor in Ireland that sees all manner of health situations. She'd have a set of patients and, different families that she would be taking care of. And the woman I spoke to, Madeleine Dawley, is a specialist in women's health and has done a lot of work in sexual health. And she really highlighted this for me, that she was working with a young woman, seeing a patient who was saying that she couldn't walk after sex. And this was with sex with her boyfriend. And she couldn't walk because it was so rough and forceful. But she explained that she didn't want to tell him to stop because he was very proud of how forceful he could be. And she was highlighting for me some of the research that's been done in this area. And what she was speaking about was the fact that it's not a widely known thing that actually anal sex is riskier for women's bodies than it is for men's bodies. And that's like a physiological thing. And she highlighted this piece that appeared in, I think it was the British Medical Journal, by two women who are academics, but they're also colorectal surgeons in the UK. Ghana and Hunter is their name, and their piece is incredibly helpful. And they highlighted the rise in popularity of heterosexual anal sex. And they talked about some of the harms that are happening to female bodies as a result of this, particularly where it is forceful. And they are talking about all kinds of things that maybe people don't want to speak about in public. But I actually have a quote here from them because I think that's most helpful. And I should also say that when they published this in the BMJ, they got a big backlash for, again.
They did?
Yes, they did. For sounding like they were being a prudish or anti-sex by highlighting these things. But remember, these are colorectal surgeons. They're dealing with women patients who are experiencing this. So they talked about the specific health concerns for women who experience anal sex. They talked about the absence of vaginal secretions, increased traumatic abrasions, and less common use of condoms increase the risk of sexually transmitted disease and anal malignancy. And they talked about pain, bleeding, and fissures. Fecal incontinence and anal sphincter injury have been reported by women. They talk about because of anal sex, women being at higher risk of incontinence than men because of their different anatomy and the effects of hormones, pregnancy, and childbirth on their pelvic floor. And essentially, what was very useful in their work is, as well as highlighting the risks, they were seeing a rise in anal sex, particularly among young women, and they very much associate that with the influence of pornography. And what they're saying is that a lot of young women, because of the expectations that and what they've learned from pornography, are kind of agreeing to anal sex, seeing it as, this is kind of standard and this is what my partner will expect or whatever, without being aware of those risks and without being aware that anal sex is riskier, as I said, for the female body. And I just think that's probably not something that's widely known or that people want to widely speak about. But if we're talking about particularly the very forceful type of anal sex that we see, that's kind of very quick and forceful in pornography, this expectation that girls and young women should kind of submit and agree to that if that's what their male partner wants, I think it's something probably difficult as it is that we do need to be talking more about.
And we can't really expect those that have been harmed to get up publicly and talk about their incontinence. It's not fair. It's not realistic. And that's why we're not going to have a big movement of people coming out telling the public this kind of information about themselves. So again, sex positivity, there seems to be a lot of knowledge of different sex acts, including what used to be very fringe or rightfully considered risky and dangerous, but there isn't also a growth in knowledge about the risks. That's not there.
Right.
And it's actively kept down. It's a sad irony. And same with strangulation, that's mistermed as choking. I myself only a couple of years ago learned the details of that. And again, like just looking at the rates of young people, I mean, one number from your study is 24% of women had experienced strangulation in a sexual context between the ages of 12 and 17. A third of UK men under 40 reported having strangled someone in a sexual context before. Somewhere between a half and 2/3 of women in the UK and US reported having been strangled. That's an insane rate. And I see so-called choking in pop culture all the time.
Sure.
Like the visual of the man's large hand around the delicate neck of a woman is eroticized in music videos and in gaming culture and fan fiction and just regular romance fiction at this stage. I mean, I know there's a lot of like book covers with a man with his hand around a woman's throat. So the visual of it is omnipresent, but people don't understand this can actually kill women. It does kill women quite regularly, and if not, it can significantly impair them long term. So can you list those risks for us?
So first, to just reflect that it is so common now and prevalent that it is absolutely this idea of choking, which is, as I explained earlier, should technically be better understood as strangulation. So usually hands around the neck, hand or hands, has absolutely entered pop culture in a very pornography inspired way. So I'm the same, I was coming across it in kind of memes and hashtags on social media and in really popular song lyrics. Like there was a US #1 last year, I think it's Jack Harlow, who raps about it, I'm vanilla baby, I'll choke you, but I ain't no killer baby. So he's talking about, it's almost saying it's vanilla just to choke somebody, but it's a choke a woman, but it's okay because he won't actually go on to kill you. Just this kind of stuff. I also hear from young people that there's videos on YouTube and different places how to choke someone safely, etc.
Yeah.
And I think the medical community are really, really clear on this. There is no safe way to choke, and technically there is no safe way to strangle somebody. Like, it's not possible. The risks are, quite severe. And I looked at some really helpful research, both from the US and the UK. We're talking about risks like asphyxiation, obviously, seizure, stroke, heart attack. Like the list of potential kind of dangers was extremely long and quite frightening. There is also an issue that some women have experienced where their body doesn't have an immediate reaction to the choking, but a day or so later, their throats swell up and they feel like they can't breathe and they end up being hospitalized. So it can also have a delayed effect and a delayed impact, which is really scary. And there's a British academic who talks about it. The way she described it, I just thought was I think the way she kind of conveyed the understanding of the impacts of this is that we talk obviously a lot in the context of sexual relationships about consent, don't we? And one of the main organ you use to give and then withdraw consent is your voice, your mouth, your vocal cords. And she was talking about the fact that in the context of strangulation, your ability to withdraw consent or to just say, like, stop, I can't breathe, is actually removed if your vocal cords are being compromised or if you're passing out. You could obviously have dizziness, lightheadedness, all the way down to unconsciousness as a result of being strangled. And she's saying the very organ, your voice, that can help you to prevent the act from going too far is potentially rendered unusable by the act, if that makes sense. In, I think, 2022 in Ireland, we introduced some new offences of non-fatal strangulation. And it's obviously a useful and positive and good thing to have that on our statute book, that this should be an offence, right? But it was that legislation almost came not quite out of nowhere. It came out from a place of we had a woman Minister for Justice who was very active in the space of addressing violence against women and girls. But we got that on our statute books within a very short space of time. And my understanding is because the recognition that this was something that was on the increase, non-fatal strangulation of women. So where women are assaulted, strangled, they don't die, but, so it's not a fatal incident, but it's still very serious. And the only thing we could attribute the need for that legislation for was pornography, the extent to which pornography has inspired the use of strangulation as a common sexual practice, in almost all cases done by the male to the female.
And do you know if that law has had an impact? Are there campaigns around it, awareness, convictions, cases discussed in public?
So it's very interesting because in a very similar time frame, similar legislation was being brought in Northern Ireland, which is, on our island, but is part of the United Kingdom jurisdiction. And actually they were more proactive. They had like a public education campaign, and they had a very large number of cases. I don't remember the exact number, but they had quite a significant number of cases all reported very quickly once the law came into existence. So I guess that's also the impact of the awareness raising campaign, that women began to understand, actually, this is an offence against me. Here in the Republic of Ireland, it's a little bit early to say for us, but there has at least been more media reporting of this as being an offence. But I think we've only had our first case in the last year before the courts of somebody who raped a woman, and in the context of the rape there was an incident or several incidents of non-fatal strangulation. And it was the first time, I think, that offence had been, somebody had been prosecuted. So it's for us in the South, it's a bit too early to say. It's also probably work to do, first of all, to raise a public awareness of it, but also to probably raise the awareness of our police that this is now understood as technically offence and it's on our statute books. But I suppose I just find it crazy that, we're in a place where we're having to formulate law in response to pornography's control of sexual activity.
Yeah.
Or influence on sexual activity.
I find it really wild that people see themselves as defenders of pleasure and freedom, but we're literally talking about people dying. But also what was very explicit in your study was that if you ask young girls and women what have been scary or terrifying sexual experiences, strangulation is listed. I believe it was number one, or at least among the top experiences. So it's not women and girls saying, we want this, we're keen for this. I mean, I'm of the persuasion, if you can, because, okay, here's a very sad truth. You can convince women of very harmful things, that very harmful things are good for them. If you asked a lot of women in sub-Saharan Africa whether FGM is good, a lot of them would say yes.
Yeah.
It does not mean it is. So we do not have to accept a cultural practice just because you have a very loud group of women saying they want it. But on this, not only do the expert tell you this is very dangerous, the people most impacted by it are saying, we don't even want this. So there's nothing sex positive here, not even remotely. It's just, this whole word doesn't belong anywhere near this phenomenon.
Right. And I think from what I hear from those who work at the front line with young people, actually young people, both boys and girls, are crying out for a space to safely discuss some of these issues. But there's all that peer pressure to appear cool and, sex positive, however you want to define that, and not to kind of question what's now become the norm. Talking to educators, it's only with doing quite a lot of work with young people to create that safe space for them to have conversations. And also sometimes that needs to be in single sex spaces, because often girls will feel more comfortable in that space to reveal some of what they're experiencing and to say, this wasn't what I wanted, or this wasn't pleasurable for me, or this wasn't what I wanted to do. But I think what we kind of concluded from the study was, because of the extent to which pornography is shaping young people's sexual scripts, in other words, the cues and rules they learn about what should and shouldn't be appropriate sexual behavior once they go on to, get into intimate relationships or whatever, have intimate encounters. Because of the extent to which pornography is influencing their sexual scripts, it's doing two things which have a gender difference. So for boys, it's teaching them, that women like aggression, they like force, they sometimes say no, but really they mean yes, all of those kind of things. And because boys are so impressionable at that age, and of course they're curious, they're interested in sex, their hormones are racing, etc., all of that, there was kind of a conclusion that the pornography industry is shaping or even grooming boys to become perpetrators.
Mm-hmm.
Because we are seeing boys end up in the criminal justice system for acting out things that they learnt in porn. At the same time, and this gender difference is key, I think, pornography is grooming girls to submit to acts that they do not want, do not enjoy, and find painful, degrading, humiliating, etc. Because they've understood and learned from porn, I'm a girl, and this is the expectation of what I have to provide or deliver or submit to, or even consent to. So we could talk about this all day as well, but it did really lead us to talk about the need for a more nuanced understanding of consent, so that when we can teach this concept of sexual consent to young people, that we can't ignore the influence that porn has probably already had in their lives before they even have this conversation about consent. Consent to what, you know? Young women, as you said, are consenting to all sorts of horrendous things because they believe that that's what's expected of them, or it's with their boyfriend and they want to keep their boyfriend and they're afraid he'll leave them if they don't do the things the boy has seen in porn and is now asking her to act out, etc., etc. Or they'll be called a prude, or they'll be called frigid, or they'll be called any of those things, a cock tease, whatever. So I think we're in a really not a good place where young women are, quote unquote, consenting to things that actually they really don't find pleasurable and they really don't want to do, and that they regret or feel trauma perhaps about afterwards. And I think that that's maybe at the very core of the influence of the sex trade on young people's sexual relationships, is grooming some to be perpetrators, the boys.
Yeah.
Again, not all of them, you know, it's always that thing of, well, are you saying this about everybody? No, but the data certainly bears out that, you know, if you're engaged as a boy in consumption of pornography, but particularly problematic high frequency consumption, this is shaping your attitudes and shaping your behaviors in intimate relationships. Yeah. And at the same time, this grooming of girls to submit, stroke, quote unquote, consent to stuff that does not prioritize their pleasure and that they otherwise would not want to do, but they almost feel coerced by the circumstances to submit or acquiesce to it.
Yes. And so one of the things that I didn't know that was in your study was that what's often called child-on-child sexual abuse, though we just talked about maybe boy on girl would be more accurate in most cases, that when a child abuse case makes its way through the justice system, it used to be the majority of perpetrators were adults, and now it's peers. So that is a huge shift. And just taking one example, which is... this is anecdotal, but I know it's a mass phenomenon, again, across the world. It happened at my school that a girl took explicit images of herself and sent them to a boy, and he shared it with the whole class. And the police had to get involved because it's a child pornography case. Kids, like, it's so normalized to take explicit images of oneself, even from minors, that they don't know that creating, sending, sharing. In Germany, we've had some trouble with legislation around this because I believe if it, like, let's say this was a photo made of, I was a teenager, it was a photo made of my friend, and I was just trying to get help from the adults. If I have that on my phone, I can be implicated. So the laws around this can be really adding harm to an already harmful situation where the wrong people can get up prosecuted. At the same time, you do have to, what is the consequence? At my school, what actually ended up happening is that both the boy and the girl were asked to apologize to us, the class. And
what?
At the time, I didn't, because I was 15, I didn't really understand what was going on. Afterwards, I'm like, what were we doing to that girl? That is, it was like, oh, you've exposed the class to this material. So they both had to stand up in front of the blackboard and apologize to us. And I just, whenever I think back to it, I'm like, what? Like, she went through hell with the entire class seeing that, and then she had to apologize to us like we were injured. I mean, I would hope that other schools deal with it better, but it is depressing that they have to deal with this. And I've heard from so many. My friend was telling me about she spent a year in Brazil, and she had male classmates talking about how they are collecting nude images of girls in the class. Like, when they date someone, that boy will share that with all his friends, like trophies. And so one of the boys in the class had a whole folder on his PC just with as many images of girls from the school as possible, that sort of thing. And it almost leaves you speechless, right? I know. But yeah, just...
Okay, so pick up on two things there. So you're talking about child-on-child sexual abuse, or like peer-on-peer, if we're talking about under 18s. And like, just as I talked about the kind of grooming that the pornography trade does, I think here in this instance, you know, the gender breakdown is really important as well, because there hasn't been a tip in the balance in terms of, it would appear, the prevalence, at least of reported cases of sexual violence, where a greater number of the perpetrators are now under 18. But if you were to look in the round at those statistics, you would find that the majority of those who are under 18 and have perpetrated some kind of sexual violence, yeah, the majority are boys. And particularly for what you might consider the more extreme cases that like end up in court. We're seeing that pattern in the UK and Ireland. We're actually seeing judges and prosecutors and police in both jurisdictions speak out about it and say there's something going on here with pornography. Because very often, if you look at these more extreme cases, and I'm also thinking of one of a boy in Ireland who was, I think, only about 13 or 14, but attacked an adult woman in the street, like violently sexually assaulted her just in the street. And again, pornography was found on his phone, and it was understood that he'd been viewing it from the age of 11. So I think when we're seeing that tip in the balance, I think you're right. There's gendered differences within that we need to be cognizant of. And it comes back to what I was talking before about what pornography is teaching young boys, what to expect or seek, from women and girls. Or if they don't get that, to just take it anyway, And then in terms of the issue of image-based sexual abuse, so coming back to the kind of origins of our study, it was commissioned by Women's Aid, which did, I think, surprise some people because they're working with women who are, living with or escaping domestic violence, intimate partner abuse. But they came to this study for two reasons. First of all, they run a helpline where women were contacting and saying that part of the coercive control I'm experiencing in my relationship is that my abusive partner is asking me to act out, watch porn with him or act out content that he has, gleaned from pornography. So they were talking about pornography providing a kind of blueprint for violence against women amongst the women that they support. But a huge issue for them in their work, particularly with young women, is this issue of, as it's become known, IBSA, image-based sexual abuse. And very much what that is the sharing of intimate images or video without consent. Women are primarily the victims of that, women and girls, of course. And very often it's happening in the context of a coercive relationship. Either a current partner or a former partner is the one that often shares those images. And we try to dig a little bit into the study about what's that all about. Sometimes those images are very consensually shared within the context of a sexual relationship. And the woman has no idea that perhaps when that relationship breaks down, these are suddenly out of nowhere going to be shared with peers, with friends, in all sorts of places. And sometimes it goes as far as to the woman to discover her image or videos on a mainstream porn site.
Yeah.
So this is going from the intimate image shared with a partner to your intimate images and videos on Pornhub or similar platforms. But this is what we try to look at. It was kind of like a circular thing. Where does this come from? Like, you're right, the sharing of intimate images in intimate relationships is now really, really common. And it's very often the male partner requesting it from their female partner. We're talking here about heterosexual relationships. Where does that come from? Where does that demand to own and possess intimate images and video of your partner come from? And we really feel that is also something pornography inspired. And then all this trading and sharing of it, the trading and sharing, sometimes for money, sometimes for free on platforms like Discord and things like that. The trading and sharing and swapping for kudos, I don't know what. Like intimate imagery of women and girls has become like a currency or I don't know. I think we just saw that pornography heavily influenced all of this behavior. It influenced the behavior of somebody who's perpetrating IBSA, so who's onward sharing images that they don't have consent to share and then making sure that they end up perhaps on Pornhub or the like, but also inspiring the very request in the first place to receive those intimate images. Through pornography and the existence of the sex trade more broadly, I just feel like we're moving to a place where women and girls' bodies and intimate representations of our bodies are just becoming something for public consumption.
If we were in an actual healthy, respectful, sex positive culture, maybe it, in a very trusting relationship, making erotic photos wouldn't be an issue. But porn is destroying that. Again, porn is destroying. There could be a careful, safe version of this, possibly, but it's at this stage feels like an alternate universe. I was having so many thoughts while you were speaking. I'm going to go over a few of them. One was, so I think it's pretty clear that women in porn are dehumanized. And so if any woman is perceived to be like a woman in porn, then she is dehumanized. I think that's why those images are being shared. You can go even further. Let's say you've got nothing to do with this at all. You've never sexted someone an image or video in your life. I remember when Mia Khalifa, who was in the porn industry, and that's a story for another day, what she went through in the context of this, but she's quite well known. She has a very distinct look of dark hair, strong eyebrows, and glasses. Teenage girls were reporting when her fame went through the roof that if they had a similar look, like I said, dark hair, strong eyebrows, glasses, they were being harassed for looking like the so-called porn star. It's like, can you even escape it? And then on top of this, now technology permits, right? AI, this is what I'm worried about. And I'm still seeking an expert to come on the show and talk about this in depth. The AI side of things where, okay, let's say a girl and boy have broken up. He doesn't have nude images, but today he doesn't need any Photoshop skills to create them.
No.
There is now AI technology where he can take, let's say, just a photo of, head and shoulders at the beach, or, well, frankly, he just needs the face. That's all he needs, and easily transfer it onto an image taken from porn and distribute that, and it will look real. I mean, people are already, I sometimes have trouble recognizing AI images when I'm not familiar with a specific, this fake history AI images, this fake celebrity AI. Many people still don't know this can happen to anyone at this stage who has any kind of visual material online, up to the point of taking that, let's say, ex-girlfriend's face and putting it on an entire realistic looking hardcore porn video.
Yeah.
That's how far it goes. And this is what I'm really, really scared of, because if this becomes a mass phenomenon and it is growing, what do we do? Because I don't want women and girls to not exist online, or what are we supposed to never ever be photographed in our life? Are we? This is because that is the reality in extreme conservative Islamist societies. That's where female politicians their face cannot be on the poster. They put flowers instead, because women's even their face is an issue, right? And that's where porn culture and extreme religious societies come full circle and produce the same outcome. Can women not be public figures then? Because at this stage, if you are a public figure, let's say right or left wing, AOC, or you're Giorgia Meloni, there is AI hardcore pornography of you out there.
Of course.
But again, it can happen to any girl and woman. And this was very poignant in your study, experts saying we have a closing window to do something about this issue. And if we don't, all these transgressions of boundaries, disrespect, violence, they will just be normal. They're already frighteningly normal. They will just be our culture, which begs the question, what will still be regarded as violence? Where does it stop?
This is it. There's so many things, Elly, there's so many things.
Yes.
So first of all, Mia Khalifa herself has spoken about the fact that women and girls that look vaguely like her were targeted for horrendous abuse and harassment of all kinds just because they looked like her. That maybe brings in also what you mentioned perhaps in terms of just women being objectified in that way. So if you even look like a quote unquote porn star, somehow you are one. But it's the objectifying and the dehumanizing. So one of the things we were looking at in our studies is can you draw a line between problematically consuming pornography and perpetrating violence against women and girls? And the short answer is yes. Not in all cases and not in every instance, but yes, you can. Because we saw that those who were consuming particularly, quite a high amount of pornography or very frequently developed these more negative attitudes towards women and girls, which translated into behaviours, which translated into a greater likelihood to be sexually aggressive in an intimate encounter, right? So we were able to draw that line. But what's happening along the way? There is this useful study from the University of Edinburgh that talks about the fact that men who have perpetrated sexual aggression towards women often see those women as slightly less human than them. Okay, so this is the dehumanization. It's easier to harm somebody if you don't see them as quite as human as you. If they're lesser than you, they're just an animal, or they're a being that doesn't have as much value as you. So that University of Edinburgh study has a conclusion, which is we need to teach men that women are people too, right?
Yeah.
Boggles the mind.
That's the slogan of feminism.
Yeah. Women are people too. In that, there's a dehumanization, and a key place that's driving this dehumanization is the commercial sex trade, prostitution and pornography, that women are for sale, that women are objects, that women are, and then it leads into this thing about the nudifying and all of that, that women's bodies are public property. And if we know some women and girls and we want to see them naked, but they won't get naked for us, well, then we will produce some technology that makes them get naked for us. And a key thing about an app like Nudify and many others in its genre, it only works on female bodies. If you feed it a male body, it'll put breasts on a vulva on that male body and make that male body a naked female body with a male head or whatever. Who's designing this technology? You know, there's those big questions. Who's behind this? And again, for me, it comes back to this idea that we have got to a place where, women and girls' bodies are public property to such an extent that, as I said, if you can't get access to their intimate images by extracting them from them directly, you just create them. So then we go to a place where AI is heavily involved, as you've described. I'm not surprised that some of the most powerful women in the world are the victims. Taylor Swift was a high-profile victim. I think, you know, these female pop stars. And I always feel like it's some kind of it's existing in a patriarchy, and it's some kind of a misogynistic backlash. That if you're a woman who's gained power, whether it's in the world of music or the arts or politics, there's some sense in the patriarchy out there of some men saying, no, this isn't right. You shouldn't have this much power. You shouldn't be taking up this much space. So we need to dehumanize you. And the way we'll do that is we'll make you naked, or we'll fit you into a pornographic video or whatever. And that will bring you down a peg or two. And that's what you deserve. So, you know, I suppose it's how we get to a place of linking violence against women with just hating women, like with deep misogyny, you know? And then there's some who would argue that, well, if all porn is AI generated, that's great, because at least no women and girls are being harmed in its production. But I would argue that it's so realistic now, or going to become so realistic, that it's still going to have all the same negative effects on the consumption side. And it'll just be off the charts, because there's, in pornography that's produced in a quote unquote studio, there obviously are some limits to how far you can go with a woman's body in terms of damaging it, but there'll be no limits in AI.
Yes.
And I think it extends to the likes of the metasphere. We're starting to hear about the first rapes and sexual assaults occurring in the metasphere, etc. So it extends to that kind of virtual world as well. And in general, I don't know how much the internet and the online world has really been a friend to women and girls. I think it offers like some safe spaces, but I actually think that misogyny is written into it from the get-go.
Like we said at the start, 1/4 of all queries are for porn.
Yeah.
And millions and millions and millions of sites. What do you think? I mean, there's more porn than any human being could watch in many, 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 many lifetimes. And there's still more being produced, because tastes are always evolving, and it's still so lucrative. So we will have episodes, like I said, on the exact impact on the performer, on the dynamics of the industry, how they're making so much money. When there's already so much free stuff out there, it's still very, very lucrative, though rarely for the woman in front of the camera.
Mm-hmm.
I would now turn to the tentative solutions that people have come up with, because that is a big part of the study. And so this at least there's some consensus growing. I know people from across the political spectrum who do at least agree, okay, maybe not for minors, or maybe like very young impressionable people, maybe there have to be some guardrails. And so there's some kind of coalition growing there that things need to change. There's different countries that have tried things like age verification. There's a whole list of things that could be done that are being explored. And in your study, they were like, you classified them generally into the educate versus the bust approach.
Yeah.
Can you clarify what that means and what falls under those?
Sure. So we kind of had a 3-pronged thing, which was the discuss, educate, bust. And we just started with the discuss because of coming back to some of our conversation earlier. People are afraid to confront this, or they're afraid to confront it on behalf of their children if they have children or whatever. Or they're afraid to question, you know, the practices of their friends who say, you know, porn is great and I watch it all the time. Or, you know, they're afraid to have some of those conversations without, you know, where someone isn't maybe giving a kind of consideration to the impacts on them and on others, etc. So we talked about discuss, educate, bust. And I'll say something maybe about the balance, particularly between the educate and the bust. But just to mention, Our bust was about busting the business model. We didn't talk so much about that. And you were saying that another time you would have a focus on that. And I think that would be really important, because it's again a reminder that this is a massive international business. And a lot of people don't realize that, because so much of the content is free to access, right? But it is the primary way that the mainstream platforms are making money is through advertising, and then a certain number of premium subscriptions where you sign up to avoid the adverts, just like on YouTube, right? But it's the same way as how does YouTube make all its money? It's advertising, okay? So most people are going to consume porn that's on the mainstream platforms, and that's entirely free. It's just that they've been exposed to, ads on that platform, and that's how that platform is making a huge amount of its revenue.
Who advertises? Are there porn platforms advertising on other porn platforms, or who do you watch? Because I don't use any porn, and I haven't in a very, very long time. Is there ads for cars, for like I don't know, things that men like?
There's
hardware
ads,
tools. Like what?
There's ad for all sorts. Like, I think the last thing I looked at, when I was looking at it, was something like an ad for like hot sauce or nachos or something. It's often leisure things, because porn is, being presented as a leisure activity. Viewing porn is, this is your leisure, this is your free time. Why not also have a burger or a snack or some, crisp potato chips or whatever? Do you know what I mean? It's these kind of things. But when there was a big campaign trafficking hub that was led by an advocate in the US, one of the things that they did actually really target was the fact that like household names like Heinz and Kraft and people who make washing powder and all of these kind of like really standard in every household products, that those kind of mainstream family-oriented companies were advertising on those platforms. A lot of those companies have wised up to that now and moved away, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a whole other kind of niche of, as I'm saying, it is things that are products that are often focused on men, fast food. I don't know if there's cars there. There could well be. So for sure, they're still making plenty of money. And then just like on YouTube, if you set up a channel, you will make your money as the channel owner because of the number of hits, the number of views, etc., etc. It's a minuscule amount of money, but all those views add up. So it was recognizing that, huge money is being made, but as you said, not by those who end up in the, being filmed for the purpose of it. Huge money is being made. So we were talking about educating. So first of all, educating. It's about all the harms that we've just discussed, facing up to their existence, facing up to the fact that young people have such easy access to this content, and how is that influencing their kind of lives and relationships into the future. So we are talking about the kind of thing you do where you do work in schools with young people, where you start at quite an early age, but in an age appropriate way. Just talking about some of the harms of being online and some of the dangers, introducing those, and then working up to that where you're in a position where you're able to kind of work with young people to, I suppose, help them to come to their own conclusion that probably the best place to learn about, healthy, safe, happy sexuality is not the porn trade, that what the porn trade is feeding them is not an accurate depiction of what sex should look like, that it's actually, as we talked about, so much of the content is sexual violence, is harmful, is not what boys or girls as they grow, and get into relationships necessarily want to be, experiencing or engaging in. So it's education at that level with young people. It's educating parents and adults the reality of what porn is today. It's educating the public and having those public conversations. And I think within that, to be honest with you, there probably is something there for men. There's the jury is out on whether this is something you can be addicted to, but it definitely has addictive like tendencies, and there probably is needs there for supports for men who've like gone down that slippery slope, and boys too, or to stop boys from ever getting there.
I've heard from some girls and women who use it in times of stress to self-regulate.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think we're hearing even less from those girls and young women, and we need to know more and understand more what that's all about and like the supports that they need. And then the bust was to just limit the access to pornography to the extent that it can't be such a powerful and lucrative trade. Why should this trade step into our lives and be shaping our sexual scripts and directly influencing our sexual relationships? And this is what people who've consumed it, let alone those who are harmed in the making of it, people who are consuming it are talking about their lives in different ways having been ruined by the hold that pornography took either over them or their partner or their son or whoever it was. And the implications of that. Why should we allow this trade just kind of run rampage through our lives? So let's try to hold it at bay. Let's have less people engaging on the platforms. let's prevent children from finding them in the first place and becoming drawn in and going down the rabbit holes and ultimately in some cases becoming reliant on it. Let's not have the next generation, have their sexual scripts shaped in this way. So yes, there are techniques like age verification, and one of the kind of consensus we identified in our study was every expert we spoke to said, at the very, very least, children and young people, the consumers of the future, should not have access to this sexually violent content. So it's not a perfect silver bullet. Nothing ever is in the social world, but it's a starting point to say, well, at least we are protecting children and young people from stuff that, they shouldn't be exposed to because of the extent and nature of the violence within it. So age verification is one way. And then, for those young people who have already seen it and experienced it and maybe acted it out, putting in place supports for them, or just, education again, as I said, around the harms. And then we recognize that around the pornography trade is a lobby. And as I said, the cheerleaders of the sex trade, the lobby that are always going to seek to protect it. And they'll be talking about the grounds of privacy and the grounds of free speech and all of those things. And, the question is, are we going to put privacy and free speech, are we going to prioritize that very highly over children seeing rape on screen? Which is more important to kind of protect there? Who is more important to protect? And, I'm loath at the same time to just talk about the kind of the think of the children approach, because this is harming, adult women as well. It's just that if you want to take it in a step-by-step approach, a good place to start is the kind of children and young people argument, because we know how influential it is in their lives and that there are possible ways to stop it. And in many countries, I think we have legislation that isn't being invoked and implemented. And if you invoked or implemented it in the right way, you could look at things like, stopping children being exposed to this content. In other countries, they may need new legislation. But the trade is very powerful and it has a strong lobby, as I said. And I think, in the fight against it, we need to kind of be prepared to stand up and be ready for what they'll throw at us, which is all sorts of things. And they're obviously very tech savvy as well. And they have great lawyers and all of that kind of stuff. People talk a lot about tech for good, but I really feel like we need a lot of good people with good understanding of technology and how it works to join the kind of fight against this big trade, to step up and use their tools, their knowledge, their insights. Because there's no doubt that the technology out there exists to filter this content, to introduce age verification, that's robust and safe and all of that. There's no doubt that all that exists. It's just that nobody is really championing or investing in the technology to the same extent they're investing in AI that creates porn, etc., etc., So it's like businesses have to kind of think about their role in this as well. Businesses, AI. I think it's going to take a concerted effort. This isn't one that just feminists on our own are going to solve,
Yes. So I do think approaches like, I believe part of age verification, for instance, is asking for a credit card, which some young people have access to, but it's just about
reducing
the group,
right?
Yes.
So everyone will say to you, we can't do age verification because young people have VPNs. Yes, some young people do know how to use VPNs. Some young people have a credit card where they can go and purchase or register for a VPN, but it doesn't apply to all. Most 10-year-olds are not using VPNs, right? Of course, there's always going to be workarounds. Of course, there's always going to be those who don't fit into your category of who you're trying to target. But that doesn't mean we should just give up and do nothing. Do you know what I mean? We have to do something to reduce, as I said, the number of young people that are on there now, the number of consumers in general, and then the number of small kids that are going to be drawn into this in the future. Let's prevent that before it happens.
And like you mentioned, maybe we in general need some more technological, like a healthy Ludditism, if that's the right word. I'm curious to see what's happening in Australia, because as we mentioned, a lot of kids are not finding the porn on the designated site. So it's great if we limit the access, but they're actually finding it on regular social media.
Sure.
And if I'm not mistaken, Australia is now moving to ban social media for anyone under 16.
Yeah.
Well, social media has all these other issues. I mean, the cyberbullying and body image and scam artists who love targeting old people and very young people. I mean, I personally, I didn't have a smartphone until I was 18. I'm very glad. In Germany, porn is just on TV. So that's we have a different designated episode to talk about that reality. But still, that strikes me as the right approach. I wonder, how are Meta and Twitter and all these other companies going to react that they're now going to be losing possibly going to start losing the under 14s, under 16s, depending on the country. Because I'm hoping it will be implemented. I'm hoping it'll work, and I hope it'll sweep to other countries. Because I mean, the internet is a crime scene. I mean, we mentioned the content moderators. That deserves its own episode because, frankly, that is largely. I know that many of them are based in Kenya or they're poor Americans. These are very, very underprivileged people.
Yes, they are.
Having to watch just incredibly disturbing material, anything from war crimes in Ukraine to animal abuse, pornography, and everything in between. So we really have a gigantic crime scene to clean up. And
I think you're right. Like, addressing access to technology itself is a part of all of this. And I am a big supporter of putting in those kind of age gates or age limits for social media, because every day nearly there's a study about some new harm that's emanated from the online space and that is affecting young people and their mental health and all of that, you know. So we have a move in Ireland to have no smartphones in primary school. So in Ireland, you usually transition to primary school at around the age of 12. So at least to have a kind of smartphone-free life up until the age of 12. Others would say it should be later and would argue that it should be later than that, which might make sense. Certainly the access to social media, I'm now hearing about there's new child-friendly versions or children's controls being put on Snapchat and platforms like that, Instagram. Like, all of those moves are positive to limit just this free access that young people have, and then all the opportunities for the pornography trade to reach out to them. And then another comment I'd make in that space is that there's a lot of discussion about these online harms, which is really, really important. But my concern is that sometimes they get all lumped together. So the eating disorders get linked with the suicidal ideation harms online, gets linked with the pornographic content, gets linked, all of these different things get linked. And it gets wrapped up in online harms without us really breaking down what those components are. And I also think sometimes it serves to deal with the discomfort of people who don't want to talk about pornography. So they'll just frame it as online harms, and they don't want to get too much into the detailed pornography in case they fear, you know, they'll come across as judgmental or any of those things we've spoken about. But also, we have to again come back to the global industry. There isn't a massive global industry promoting suicidal ideation. Just to be clear, promoting suicidal ideation to children is a horrendous thing to do, but there isn't per se a massive global industry doing that that's making loads of money every second. But there's a massive global industry promoting pornographic content to children and young people. And that's something that if we focus in on that and really grasp it and get a handle on it, I think we would make a huge difference in terms of reducing online harm overall. But again, recognizing that there's a business model there that we need to tackle and bust.
Yes, and there'll be hopefully many future episodes dedicated to going deeper on all these different things. Before we finish, I'd like to ask if I can jump that question on you, because you did a lot of the research, was speaking to experts, reading the material, speaking to affected populations. If you can, like, top of your head, think of both something dark and something hopeful that surprised you in the research.
Perhaps the darkest element was really starting to understand how there are so many, I suppose, men and boys, but particularly men, who believe they have a right to intimate images and video of women and girls, and that they'll go to the extent of seeking this out. So, you know, sometimes when there's a very high profile rape case in the media, men are going online to see if there is video of that available. You know, and that kind of blows my mind, this idea of us, of our bodies as a sort of public property to be consumed almost for entertainment. And then linked to that, so sorry, this is kind of two dark things, but linked to that is the role, just as you so well highlighted, of technology and where AI is going to take all of this kind of abuse, the level to which that's going to take. So that was my kind of darkest takeaway from the research. And then my most positive takeaway was, I suppose, towards the end when we were looking at what can be done, you know, what can be done, what are the next steps, that at least in the Irish context, I met some really amazing people who are in academia and psychotherapy and teachers working with young people and doctors and people who understand IT and lawyers and like people from lots of different backgrounds who really want to do something, who really want to figure this out, who are really concerned about what a big problem it is, but they have the willingness and the passion, I suppose, to try and address it. And that's kind of the point we are at in Ireland, is that I can see, we're not a big country, and I can see all around the country these experts in their own different areas who are really, really concerned about this, and they want to do something, but not all of us have figured out yet what that is. But we're right at the point now, and Women's Aid, you know, are very much involved in this, building on this study that they commissioned us to do in bringing all these people together. So we're going to have a moment this year where we all come together from our different walks of life and areas of expertise and really talk about how do we grasp the nettle on this. And like, I feel really positive and excited about that I've met a lot of people in this process who are really passionate about this. And they're not necessarily all feminists, but they're really passionate, particularly in terms of the harms they can see to children and young people. And I think we're going to have an opportunity to kind of come together, and this is going to be strength in numbers. So that feels positive and hopeful.
Yes. And if anyone listening feels inspired to get active on this issue, they're based in Ireland or UK, where should they go? Or
So I think that's a good question, because I think right now it's just as I explained, we don't quite have a hub, or we haven't yet come together collectively, but I think we're getting very close to that. There's a campaign running called Gen Free, which is looking at the wider online harms that we were talking about, but looking at young people growing up being more free from their smartphone and more living lives that are a bit freer of technology. And I think that that's a really good campaign to look at. But I think it's also a case of certainly if people are interested and want to know more, they can come, as you said, to our website, serp.ie, and just check out the study and some of our findings. I think Women's Aid have been doing some really good work in this area in Ireland. And I think it's also a case of watch this space. I hope over the next year or so, we are going to come together in a more coordinated effort. And that'll be something that everyone, hopefully, no matter who you are or what your background is, that you can get involved in.
And when it comes to, I do have some contacts in the US and Germany as well. I'll put some places to go for listeners who want to look around.
That'd be great. And I suppose some of the most well-known in terms of tools and materials to address this is probably Culture Reframed, which is the organisation in the US run by Gail.
Yes.
She's really taking a public health approach to this, but there's some great tools and resources there for parents of children of different ages and for educators, etc.
Yeah. And she has been on this show as well, so I will link that episode. So thank you, everyone, so much for listening.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your time. Thanks, Elly.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.